Ranger's Apprentice, Book 1, The Runes of Gorlan. Chapter 1. Try to eat something well. Tomorrow's a big day, after all. Jenny, blonde, pretty and cheerful, gestured towards Will's barely touched plate and smiled encouragingly at him. Will made an attempt to return the smile, but it was a dismal failure. He picked through the plate before and piled high with his favorite foods. Tonight, his stomach knotted tight with tension and anticipation. He could barely bring himself to swallow a bite. Tomorrow would be a big day, he knew. He knew all too well, in fact. Tomorrow would be the biggest day of his life, because tomorrow was the choosing day, and it would determine how he spent the rest of his life. "Nerves, I imagine," said George, setting down his loaded fork and seizing the lapels of his jacket in a dubious manner. He was a thin, gangly, and studious boy, fascinated by rules and regulations, and with a penchant for examining and debating both sides of any question, sometimes at great length. Dreadful thing, nervousness. It can freeze you up so you can't think, can't eat, can't speak. "I'm not nervous," Will said quickly, noticing that Horace had looked up, ready to form a sarcastic comment. George nodded several times, considering Will's statement. "On the other hand," he added, "a little nervousness can actually improve performance. It can heighten your perception and sharpen your reactions. So, the fact that you are worried, if, in fact, you are, is not necessarily something to be worried about, or of itself, so to speak." In spite of himself, a wry smile touched Will's mouth. George would be natural in the legal profession, he thought. He would almost certainly be the scribe-master's choice on the following morning. Perhaps, Will thought, that it was the heart of his own problem. He was only one of the ward-mates who had any fears about the choosing that would take place in 12 hours. "He ought to be nervous," Horace scoffed. "After all, which craft-master's going to want him as an apprentice?" "I'm sure we're all nervous," Alice said. She directed one of her rare smiles at Will. "We'd be stupid not to be." "Well, I'm not," Horace said, and then reddened as Alice raised one eyebrow and Jenny giggled. It was typical of Alice, Will thought. He knew that the tall, graceful girl had already been promised a place as an apprentice by Lady Pauline, head of the Castle Redmont's diplomatic service. Her pretense that she was nervous about the following day, and her tact in refraining from pointing out Horace's gaffe, showed that she was already a diplomat of some skill. Jenny, of course, would gravitate immediately towards the castle's kitchens, domain of Master Chubb, Redmont's head chef. He was a man renowned throughout the kingdom for the banquets served in the castle's massive dining hall. Jenny loved food and cooking, and her easygoing nature and unfailing good humor would make her an invaluable staff member in the turmoil of the castle kitchens. Battle school would be Horace's choice. Will glanced at his wardmate now, hungrily tucking into the roast turkey, ham, and potatoes that he had heaped onto his plate. Horace was big for his age, a natural athlete. The chances that he would be refused were virtually non-existent. Horace was exactly the type of recruit that Sir Rodney looked for in his warrior apprentices. Strong, athletic, fit, and, Will thought, a trifle sourly, not too bright. Battle school was the path to knighthood for boys like Horace, born commoners but with physical abilities to serve as knights of the kingdom. Which left Will. What would his choice be? More importantly, as Horace had pointed out, what craftsmaster would accept him as an apprentice? For choosing day was the pivotal point of the life of the castle wards. They were orphan children, raised by the generosity of Baron Arnold, a lord of Redmond fief. For the most part, their parents had died in the service of the fief, and now the Baron saw it in his responsibility to care for and raise the children of his former subjects, and to give them an opportunity to improve their station in life wherever possible. Choosing day provided that opportunity. Each year, castle wards turning 15 could apply to be apprenticed to masters of various crafts that served in the castle and its people. Ordinarily, crafts apprentices were selected by dint of their parents' occupations or influence with craft masters. The castle ward usually had no such influence, and this was their chance to win a future for themselves. Those wards who weren't chosen, or whom no openings could be found, would be assigned to farming families in the nearby village, providing farm labor to raise the crops and animals that fed the castle's inhabitants. It was rare for this to happen, Will knew, and the Baron and his craftmasters usually went out of the way to fit the wards into one craft or another. But it could happen, and it was a fate he feared more than anything. Horace caught his eye now and gave him a smug smile. "Still planning on applying for battle school, Will?" he asked, through a mouthful of turkey and potatoes. "Better eat something, then. You'll need to build yourself up a little." He snorted with laughter, and Will glowered at him. A few weeks previously, Horace had overheard Will confiding to Alice that he desperately wanted to be selected for battle school, and he had made Will's life a misery ever since, pointing out every possible occasion that Will's slight build was totally unsuited for the rigors of battle school training. The fact that Horace was probably right only made matters worse. Where Horace was tall and muscular, Will was small and wiry. He was agile and fast and surprisingly strong, but he simply didn't have the size that he knew was required for battle school apprentices. He hoped against hope for the past few years that he would have what people called his growth spurt before the choosing day came around. But it never happened, and now the day was nearly there. As Will said nothing, Horace sensed that he had scored a verbal hit. This was a rarity in their turbulent relationship. Over the past few years, he and Will clashed repeatedly. Being the stronger of the two, Horace usually got the better of Will, although, occasionally, Will's speed and agility allowed him to get a surprise kick or punch and then escape before Horace could catch him. But while Horace generally had the best of their physical clashes, it was unusual for him to win any of their verbal encounters. Will's wit was as agile as the rest of him, and he almost always managed to have the last word. His mother died in childbirth. His father died a hero. Please care for him. His name is Will. That year, there had only been one ward. Alyssa's father was a cavalry lieutenant who had died in the Battle of Hackleham Heath, when Morgrath's Wargle army had been defeated and driven back into the mountains. Alyssa's mother, devastated by her loss, succumbed to a fever some weeks after giving birth, so there was plenty of room in the ward for the unknown child. And Baron Arnold was, at heart, a kindly man. Even though circumstances were unusual, he had given permission for Will to be accepted as a ward castle of Vermont. It seemed logical to assume that, if there was a note was true, Will's father had died in the war against Morgrath, and since Baron Arnold had taken a leading part in that war, he felt dutifully bound to honor the unknown father's sacrifice. So Will had become a Redmont ward, raised and educated by the Baron's generosity. As time passed, the others gradually joined him and Alice until there were 5 in their year group. But while the others had memories of their parents, or, in Alice's case, people who knew them and could tell her about them, Will knew nothing of his past. That was why he had invented the story that sustained him throughout his childhood in the ward. And as the years passed, he added detail and color to that story, and eventually he became to believe it himself. His father, he knew, had died a hero's death, so it made sense to create a picture of him as a hero, a knight in full armor, fighting against the Wargle's hordes, cutting them down left and right until eventually he was overcome by sheer weight of numbers. Will had pictured the tall figure so often in his mind, seeing every detail of his armor and his equipment, but never being able to visualize his face. As a warrior, his father would expect him to follow in his footsteps. That is why selection for the battle school was so important to Will, and that was why the more unlikely it became that he would be selected, the more desperately he clung to the hope that he might. He exited from the ward building into the deepened castle yard. The sun was long down, and the torches placed every 20 meters or so on the castle walls shed a flickering light, uneven light. He hesitated a moment. He would not return to the ward and face Horace's continued taunts. To do so would only lead to another fight between him, a fight that Will knew he would probably lose. George would probably try to analyze the situation for him, and looking at both sides of the question thoroughly confusing the issue. Alyssa and Jenny might comfort him, he knew, Alyssa particularly since they had grown up together. But at the moment, he didn't want their sympathy, and he couldn't face Horace's taunts, so he headed for the one place he knew he could find solitude. The huge fig tree grown close by the castle's central had often afforded him a haven. Heights held no fear for Will, and he climbed smoothly into the tree, continuing long after one might have stopped, until he was on the lighter branches at the very top, branches that swayed and dipped under his height. In the past, he had often escaped from Horace up here. The bigger boy couldn't match Will's speed, and the tree was unwilling to follow as high as this. Will found a convenient fork and wedged himself in it, his body giving slightly to the movement of the tree branches as the branches swayed in the evening breeze. Below, the foreshortened figures of the watch made their rounds in the castle yard. He heard the door of the ward building open, and glancing down, he saw Alyssa emerge, looking out the front yard for him in vain. The tall girl hesitated a few moments, then, seeming to shrug, turned back inside. The elongated rectangle of light that the door threw across the yard cut off as she closed the door softly behind her. Strange, he thought, how seldom people tend to look up. There was a rustle of soft feathers, and a barn owl landed on the next branch, its head swiveling, its huge eyes catching every last ray in the faint light. It studied him without concern, seeming to know it had nothing to fear from him. It was a hunter, a silent flyer, a ruler of the night. "At least you know who you are," he said softly to the bird. Its head swiveled again, then launched himself into the darkness, leaving alone with his thoughts. Gradually he sat there. The lights of the castle went out one by one. Torches burnt out to smoldering husks and were replaced at midday by the change of watch. Eventually there was only one light left burning, and that, he knew, was the Baron's study, where the Lord of Redmont was presumably still at work, poring over reports and papers. The study was virtually level with Will's position in the tree, and he could see the burly figure of Baron seated at his desk. Finally, Baron Arnold rose, stretched, and leaned forward to extinguish the lamp he left in his room, heading for his sleeping quarters on the floor above. Now the castle was asleep, except for the guards on the walls who kept constant watch. In less than 9 hours, Will realized, he would face the choosing. Silently, miserably, fearing for the worst, he climbed down the tree and made his way to bed in the darkened boys' dormitory in the ward.